In the cold grey streets of 19th century St. Petersburg, a man walked who would change how humanity understands itself forever. Fyodor Dostoevsky was not just a novelist. He was a philosopher, a psychologist, a prophet, and a spiritual revolutionary who anticipated the greatest discoveries of the 20th century. Long before Freud explored the unconscious mind, Dostoevsky had mapped its darkest territories. Decades before existentialists declared that existence precedes essence, Dostoevsky had dramatized this truth through unforgettable characters. Years before totalitarian regimes arose to terrorize the world, Dostoevsky had predicted exactly how they would operate and why they would appeal to millions of people. What you are about to hear is every major philosophical idea that this genius ever developed. This is not mere literature we are discussing. These novels and stories contain the most profound insights into human nature ever written. They explore the deepest questions that have haunted humanity since the beginning of time. Why do we suffer? What does it mean to be free? How can we find meaning in an apparently meaningless universe? What is the relationship between good and evil? Can human beings create a perfect society? Does God exist, and if so, how can we explain innocent suffering? Dostoevsky did not approach these questions as an abstract philosopher sitting in an ivory tower. He lived through some of the most traumatic experiences imaginable. He was arrested as a young man for revolutionary activities and sentenced to death by firing squad. At the last possible moment, as he stood blindfolded before the guns, a messenger arrived with news that his sentence had been commuted to hard labor in Siberia. He spent 4 years in a brutal prison camp where he witnessed the absolute depths of human cruelty and degradation. He suffered from epilepsy his entire adult life. He struggled with gambling addiction. He lost beloved children. He lived in poverty for much of his life. He knew suffering intimately, and this gave his philosophical insights a power and authenticity that purely academic philosophers could never achieve. But Dostoevsky was also a man of extraordinary genius and learning. He read voraciously in philosophy, theology, psychology, and political theory. He engaged with the greatest thinkers of his time and understood the intellectual currents that were shaping the modern world. He saw where these ideas were leading, and he was horrified by what he saw. He witnessed the rise of materialism, atheism, socialism, and scientific rationalism, and he understood that these seemingly progressive ideas contained the seeds of unprecedented human destruction. He dedicated his life to warning humanity about the dangers ahead and pointing toward a different path. The philosophy you are about to explore is not a systematic academic theory. It is a living, breathing exploration of the human soul. It emerges through characters who feel as real as the people in your own life. It is dramatized through stories that will haunt you long after you finish hearing them. It is a philosophy born from suffering, refined through genius, and offered as a gift to anyone willing to grapple with the deepest truths about human existence. Prepare yourself for a journey into the mind of one of the greatest thinkers who ever lived. Part 1. The Sacred Foundation of Human Freedom. Freedom is not a political concept for Dostoevsky. It is not about voting rights or constitutional protections or economic systems. Freedom is the metaphysical foundation of human existence itself. It is what separates human beings from animals, machines, and even angels. It is the most precious and most terrible gift that humans possess, and it is the source of both our greatest glory and our deepest misery. To understand Dostoevsky's philosophy of freedom, you must first understand what he means by the word. When most people think of freedom, they imagine the ability to do whatever they want without interference. They think of freedom from external constraints. But Dostoevsky is talking about something much more fundamental and much more disturbing. He is talking about the freedom to choose between good and evil, the freedom to act against your own self-interest, the freedom to destroy yourself and others for no rational reason whatsoever, the freedom to say no to God, to happiness, to love, to life itself. This freedom is not optional for human beings. We cannot give it up even if we want to. Even when we try to surrender our freedom to authority figures, political systems, or religious institutions, we are still making a free choice to surrender. Even when we claim that our actions are determined by genetics, social conditioning, or unconscious drives, we are still freely choosing to accept that deterministic explanation. Freedom haunts every human moment. It lurks behind every decision, no matter how small or seemingly automatic. We are condemned to be free, and this condemnation is the source of human anxiety, guilt, and existential terror. Why would anyone want such a terrible burden? Why would a loving God curse human beings with such a frightening responsibility? Because without freedom, goodness would be meaningless. A robot programmed to help people is not morally praiseworthy. An animal acting on instinct to protect its young is not exhibiting virtue. Only a being who could choose evil but freely chooses good deserves moral credit. Only a being who could reject love but freely chooses to love is capable of genuine love. Only a being who could despair but freely chooses hope is exhibiting real courage. But here is where Dostoevsky becomes truly radical. Most human beings, he argues, cannot handle this level of freedom. It is too terrifying, too burdensome, too overwhelming. Most people, when faced with genuine freedom, will do anything to escape it. They will surrender their autonomy to political leaders who promise to take care of them. They will adopt rigid ideologies that tell them exactly what to think and feel. They will lose themselves in addictions, distractions, and mindless pleasures. They will do anything to avoid the terrible responsibility of having to choose who they want to be. This creates a fundamental tragedy in human existence. The very thing that makes us human is the thing that most of us desperately want to escape. We want to be free, but we do not want the responsibility that comes with freedom. We want to make choices, but we do not want to face the consequences of our choices. We want to be good, but we do not want to struggle with the temptation to be evil. We want love, but we do not want to risk the vulnerability that genuine love requires. Dostoevsky illustrates this tragedy through the underground man, one of the most important characters in all of literature. The underground man is a former government clerk who has withdrawn from society and spends his time writing bitter notes about the nature of human existence. He is highly intelligent, deeply self-aware, and completely miserable. He understands exactly what he should do to improve his life, but he refuses to do it. He sabotages his own happiness, destroys his relationships, and wallows in his own suffering. Why does he do this? Because it is the only way he can assert his freedom. By choosing to be miserable, he proves that he is not a machine programmed for happiness. The underground man would rather suffer as a free being than be happy as a slave. This is the essence of human perversity that Dostoevsky discovered. We will choose suffering over happiness if suffering is the only way to prove our autonomy. We will act against our own interests simply to demonstrate that we are not predictable. We will embrace irrationality as a form of rebellion against any system that tries to reduce us to logical formulas. We are willing to go to hell as long as we can choose hell for ourselves rather than having heaven imposed upon us. This insight has profound implications for politics, psychology, religion, and every other area of human concern. Any system that tries to perfect human beings by eliminating their capacity for free choice will ultimately fail. Any ideology that promises to create happiness by removing the possibility of choosing unhappiness will produce rebellion and resentment. Any political program that treats people as rational actors who will always choose their own self-interest will be surprised by human perversity. Any psychological theory that tries to explain all human behavior in terms of deterministic causes will miss the irreducible element of freedom that makes us human. But Dostoevsky does not stop with this negative insight. He also shows us what freedom looks like when it is exercised in the service of love rather than rebellion. Characters like Alyosha Karamazov and Prince Mishkin demonstrate that it is possible to freely choose goodness, compassion, and self-sacrifice. These characters are not weak or naive. They understand the full horror of human existence, the reality of evil, and the temptation to despair. But they freely choose to respond with love anyway. This choice is not determined by their genetics, their upbringing, or their social circumstances. It is a free act of will that transcends all natural and social causation. This positive freedom is not easy to achieve. It requires tremendous spiritual strength, moral courage, and willingness to suffer. It cannot be programmed, taught, or legislated into existence. It must be chosen freely by each individual in the depths of their own soul. And it must be chosen again and again, moment by moment, throughout an entire lifetime. This is why Dostoevsky believed that freedom is ultimately a spiritual rather than a political or psychological category. True freedom comes not from the absence of external constraints, but from the presence of internal grace. It is the freedom to love even when love is not returned, to forgive even when forgiveness is not deserved, to hope even when hope seems impossible. The path to this higher freedom leads through suffering, and this is perhaps the most difficult aspect of Dostoevsky's philosophy for modern people to accept. We live in a culture that views suffering as an unmitigated evil to be eliminated through technology, therapy, or social reform. But Dostoevsky argues that suffering is often the only way that human beings learn to exercise their freedom responsibly. Suffering breaks down our illusions of self-sufficiency and forces us to confront the deepest questions of existence. It strips away our pretenses and reveals who we really are beneath all our social masks. It teaches us compassion for others who suffer. It opens our hearts to the possibility of redemption and transformation. Without suffering, we would remain spiritually immature, incapable of genuine love or authentic choice. Part 2. The Underground Mind and Modern Consciousness. In 1864, Dostoevsky created a character who would become the archetypal figure of modern alienation. The underground man is not just a literary creation. He is a prophetic vision of what human consciousness would become in the modern world. He represents the first fully self-aware neurotic in literature, a man whose intelligence has become his curse and whose self-consciousness has paralyzed him completely. When you understand the underground man, you understand the psychological condition of millions of people living today. The underground man begins his confession with words that have echoed through philosophy and psychology for over a century and a half. He declares himself to be a sick man, a spiteful man, an unattractive man. But these are not mere insults he is hurling at himself. They are precise diagnoses of a new form of human consciousness that was emerging in the modern world. He is sick with excessive self-awareness. He is spiteful because his intelligence has revealed the futility of human existence. He's unattractive because his hyperactive mind has made him incapable of natural, spontaneous human connection. The underground man's fundamental problem is that he thinks too much. In earlier ages, people could act on instinct, tradition, or religious faith without endless self-questioning. But the underground man has been exposed to modern education, scientific thinking, and philosophical skepticism. He cannot accept anything on faith. He cannot act on impulse without analyzing his motives. He cannot make any decision without seeing all the possible objections to that decision. He is trapped in what we might now call analysis paralysis, but Dostoevsky understood this condition decades before psychologists gave it a name. This excessive consciousness creates a terrible problem for action. The underground man knows exactly what he should do to improve his life, but knowing and doing are two completely different things. He should exercise, but he analyzes his motives for exercise until the impulse dies. He should socialize, but he anticipates every possible social embarrassment until he talks himself out of leaving his apartment. He should work on meaningful projects, but he questions the ultimate value of all human endeavors until he becomes paralyzed by nihilistic doubt. Intelligence, which should be humanity's greatest gift, has become his greatest curse. But the underground man's problems go deeper than mere overthinking. He has also lost the ability to feel genuine emotions. Everything he experiences is filtered through multiple layers of self-consciousness until the original feeling is completely distorted. When he feels angry, he immediately begins analyzing his anger, questioning its legitimacy, anticipating how others will judge it, and wondering about its deeper psychological causes. By the time he finishes this analysis, the anger has transformed into something completely different, usually self-hatred or bitter resentment. He cannot experience any emotion purely because his mind immediately begins dissecting and critiquing every feeling. This creates a fundamental alienation from his own inner life. The underground man feels like a stranger to himself. He watches his own thoughts and feelings as if they belong to someone else. He becomes divided against himself, with one part of his mind constantly observing and judging the other parts. This internal division makes authentic self-expression impossible. Everything he says or does feels artificial and calculated because it has been filtered through so many layers of self-consciousness. The underground man also suffers from what we might now call social anxiety. But again, Dostoevsky understood this condition long before it became a recognized psychological category. The underground man desperately wants human connection, but his self-consciousness makes normal social interaction almost impossible. When he enters a room full of people, he immediately begins analyzing how they are perceiving him. He notices every facial expression, every tone of voice, every gesture, and interprets them all as evidence of rejection or contempt. He becomes so focused on managing his image that he loses all ability to be genuinely present with other people. His attempts at conversation feel forced and awkward because he is constantly monitoring himself rather than simply responding naturally. This social anxiety creates a vicious cycle that traps the underground man in deeper and deeper isolation. Because he feels awkward in social situations, he begins avoiding them. But the more he isolates himself, the more awkward he becomes when he does venture out. Eventually, he develops elaborate theories about why other people are inferior, and why solitude is actually preferable to human company. These theories are really just defense mechanisms designed to protect his wounded ego, but he convinces himself that they represent sophisticated philosophical insights. He transforms his psychological problems into intellectual positions. The underground man also exhibits what psychologists would later call cognitive dissonance. He holds contradictory beliefs and desires simultaneously, and the tension between them drives him to increasingly irrational behavior. He claims to value reason above everything else, but then acts in completely irrational ways. He insists that he wants to be left alone, but then becomes furious when people ignore him. He declares that he despises society, but then becomes desperate for social approval. He proclaims his independence from conventional morality, but then tortures himself with guilt over minor transgressions. These contradictions are not accidental or temporary. They are built into the structure of modern consciousness itself. The underground man has been educated to believe in reason, individual autonomy, and scientific materialism. But human beings are not purely rational creatures, and these modern ideologies cannot satisfy their deeper emotional and spiritual needs. The result is a permanent state of internal conflict between what the underground man thinks he should believe and what he actually experiences. His mind has been modernized, but his heart still yearns for meaning, connection, and transcendence. Dostoevsky shows us that this conflict leads to a peculiar form of suffering that is distinctly modern. In earlier ages, people suffered from poverty, disease, war, and natural disasters. These forms of suffering were terrible, but they were also comprehensible and shared. The underground man suffers from something much more subtle and isolating. He suffers from the inability to believe in anything, to feel anything purely, or to connect authentically with anyone. He suffers from the loss of meaning, purpose, and genuine emotion. This is the suffering of modern alienation, and it is in many ways more devastating than physical hardship, because it attacks the very core of what makes life worth living. The underground man's response to this suffering is both pathetic and prophetic. Unable to find genuine meaning or connection, he begins to cultivate his suffering as if it were a work of art. He develops elaborate theories about why suffering is superior to happiness. He convinces himself that his alienation is actually a sign of his superior sensitivity and intelligence. He transforms his psychological problems into badges of honor. This is exactly what happened to many intellectual movements in the 20th century, from existentialism to postmodernism to various forms of identity politics. When people cannot find positive meaning, they often begin to find meaning in their victimhood, their alienation, or their rejection of conventional values. But Dostoevsky does not simply diagnose the problem of modern consciousness. He also suggests a solution, though it is not an easy one. The underground man's problems stem from his excessive reliance on rational analysis and his disconnection from deeper sources of meaning. He's lost touch with his capacity for faith, love, and self-transcendence. These capacities cannot be recovered through more thinking or better psychological techniques. They require a fundamental reorientation of the soul towards something greater than the individual ego. The underground man must learn to stop analyzing himself long enough to actually live, to stop protecting himself long enough to love, and to stop asserting his autonomy long enough to surrender to something transcendent. This is why Dostoevsky believed that the crisis of modern consciousness was ultimately a spiritual crisis rather than a psychological or social one. No amount of therapy, education, or social reform could solve the underground man's problems. He needed a complete transformation of his relationship to existence itself. He needed to rediscover the possibility of wonder, reverence, and genuine human connection. But this transformation could not be achieved through willpower or intellectual effort. It required grace, and grace comes only to those who acknowledge their own helplessness and open themselves to redemption. Part 3. The War Against Rationalism and Scientific Materialism. When Dostoevsky looked at the intellectual trends of his time, he saw humanity rushing headlong toward spiritual catastrophe. The 19th century was the age of scientific progress, rational enlightenment, and utopian social planning. Intellectuals across Europe believed that human reason could solve all problems, eliminate all suffering, and create perfect societies. They thought that science would replace religion, that education would eliminate ignorance, and that proper social organization would end poverty, crime, and conflict. To most educated people of his era, these beliefs seemed obviously correct and morally admirable. But Dostoevsky saw them as dangerous delusions that would lead to unprecedented human destruction. The fundamental error of rationalism, according to Dostoevsky, is its misunderstanding of human nature. Rationalists assume that people are essentially logical creatures who make decisions based on careful calculation of their self-interest. They believe that if you can show someone what is truly in their best interest, they will naturally choose to pursue it. If people behave irrationally or self-destructively, it must be because they lack proper education or live in corrupted social conditions. Fix the education and reform the social conditions, and human behavior will automatically improve. This view seems reasonable and humane, but Dostoevsky recognized it as a catastrophic misreading of human psychology. The problem is that human beings are not primarily rational creatures. We are emotional, spiritual, and often deeply irrational beings who frequently act against our own self-interest for psychological reasons that have nothing to do with logic. Sometimes we choose to suffer because suffering feels more authentic than artificial happiness. Sometimes we reject good advice because accepting it would require admitting that we need help. Sometimes we embrace destructive behaviors because they give us a sense of power or autonomy that we cannot find in healthy activities. And sometimes we simply act on impulse, instinct, or unconscious drives that operate below the level of rational awareness. Dostoevsky illustrates this point through countless examples in his novels. Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment commits murder, not because it serves his rational self-interest, but because he wants to prove that he is extraordinary enough to transcend moral law. The underground man sabotages his own happiness, not because he lacks knowledge of what would make him happy, but because choosing misery is the only way he can assert his freedom. Ivan Karamazov develops elaborate philosophical arguments against God, not because the evidence clearly supports atheism, but because he cannot bear the emotional burden of believing in a God who permits innocent suffering. In each case, the character's behavior is driven by deep psychological needs that have nothing to do with rational calculation. This insight has devastating implications for all utopian political schemes. If people do not behave rationally, then rational social planning cannot create perfect societies. If human behavior is driven by unconscious psychological forces, then conscious education and reform cannot eliminate antisocial behavior. If people sometimes choose suffering over happiness for existential reasons, then no amount of material improvement can guarantee human contentment. Rationalist reformers are trying to solve human problems with tools that are fundamentally inadequate to the task. They are like doctors trying to cure mental illness with surgery, or engineers trying to fix human relationships with mathematics. But Dostoevsky's critique goes deeper than simply pointing out the limitations of rational planning. He argues that excessive reliance on reason actually makes human problems worse rather than better. When people try to live purely rational lives, they cut themselves off from their own emotional and spiritual depths. They become like the underground man, trapped in their own heads, unable to feel genuine emotions or make authentic connections with other people. They lose touch with the sources of meaning, beauty and transcendence that make life worth living. Rationalism does not solve the human condition. It impoverishes it. Scientific materialism creates even more serious problems. When people begin to view themselves as nothing more than complex machines governed by physical and chemical laws, they lose their sense of human dignity and moral responsibility. If all human behavior can be explained in terms of genetics, neurology and social conditioning, then concepts like free will, moral choice and personal accountability become meaningless. Why should anyone feel guilty about their actions if those actions were determined by forces beyond their control? Why should anyone strive for moral improvement if morality is just a social construction with no objective reality? Why should anyone sacrifice their immediate desires for higher principles if there are no higher principles, only competing biological drives and social pressures? Dostoevsky saw that scientific materialism would ultimately lead to nihilism, the belief that nothing has any ultimate meaning or value. If human beings are just accidental products of blind evolutionary forces, then our lives have no inherent purpose or significance. If consciousness is just an epiphenomenon of brain chemistry, then our deepest thoughts and feelings are nothing more than chemical reactions. If moral values are just social constructions that evolved to promote group survival, then they have no binding authority over individual behavior. The logical conclusion of scientific materialism is that existence is fundamentally absurd and that all human striving is ultimately meaningless. This realization drives sensitive people to despair and less sensitive people to ruthless pursuit of power and pleasure. The political implications of this worldview are terrifying. If there are no objective moral truths, then might makes right. If human beings have no inherent dignity, then they can be manipulated, exploited and destroyed without moral qualms. If traditional values are just arbitrary social constructions, then they can be swept away and replaced with whatever ideology serves the interests of those in power. If reason is the only legitimate source of authority, then intellectuals have the right to impose their rational schemes on everyone else, regardless of what ordinary people want or believe. Dostoevsky recognized that this combination of nihilism and rationalism would eventually produce totalitarian movements that would treat human beings as raw material for social engineering projects. His novels are filled with characters who embody this dangerous combination of ideas. Raskolnikov believes that exceptional individuals have the right to transgress moral law for rational purposes. The characters in Demons are willing to commit murder and terrorism in service of their revolutionary ideologies. The Grand Inquisitor argues that the masses cannot handle freedom and must be controlled by an enlightened elite. In each case, rational arguments are used to justify irrational and immoral behavior. The characters convince themselves that they are serving higher purposes, but they are really serving their own psychological needs for power, significance, and revenge against a world that has wounded them. Dostoevsky also understood that rationalism and materialism would fail to satisfy the deepest human needs. People need meaning, purpose, beauty, love, and transcendence. They need to feel that their lives matter in some ultimate sense. They need to believe that their moral choices have real significance. They need to experience wonder, reverence, and connection to something greater than themselves. Rationalism and materialism cannot provide these things because they explicitly deny their reality or importance. A worldview that reduces everything to matter in motion cannot account for consciousness, beauty, love, or moral obligation. It leaves people spiritually starved in the midst of material abundance. This spiritual starvation creates a terrible emptiness that people try to fill with various substitutes. Some become addicted to pleasure, excitement, or novel experiences. Others lose themselves in work, achievement, or the accumulation of wealth and status. Still others embrace political ideologies that promise to give their lives meaning through identification with grand historical movements. But none of these substitutes can truly satisfy the human need for transcendent meaning. They provide temporary distraction from the underlying emptiness, but they cannot heal the spiritual wound that rationalism and materialism have created. Dostoevsky's alternative to rationalism is not irrationalism or anti-intellectualism. He was himself a highly intellectual and well-educated man who engaged seriously with the philosophical and scientific ideas of his time. His critique of reason was based on reason itself, but he insisted that reason must be balanced by faith, emotion, and spiritual intuition. Human beings need all of their faculties working together in harmony. Reason without faith becomes cold and destructive. Faith without reason becomes fanatical and superstitious, but reason guided by faith and grounded in spiritual reality can serve human flourishing. This is why Dostoevsky placed such emphasis on the role of suffering in human development. Suffering breaks down our intellectual pride and forces us to confront realities that cannot be understood through reason alone. It opens us to the possibility of grace, redemption, and spiritual transformation. It teaches us humility and compassion. It connects us to the deeper mysteries of existence that rational analysis cannot penetrate. A person who has never suffered deeply will likely remain trapped in the illusion that life can be mastered through intelligence and willpower. But a person who has been broken by suffering and then healed by grace will understand that reality is far more complex and mysterious than any rational system can capture. Part 4. The Psychology of Evil and Human Darkness. One of Dostoevsky's most disturbing insights was his recognition that evil does not come primarily from ignorance, social conditions, or external circumstances. Evil comes from the human heart itself. This was a revolutionary and deeply unpopular idea in the 19th century, when most intellectuals believed that human nature was fundamentally good and that evil behavior resulted from corrupted social institutions. If you could eliminate poverty, improve education, and reform social structures, they argued, you could eliminate crime, violence, and moral corruption. But Dostoevsky had seen too much of human nature in its raw form to accept such optimistic theories. He knew that evil was far more mysterious, persistent, and deeply rooted than social reformers wanted to admit. Dostoevsky's understanding of evil was shaped by his own experience in the Siberian prison camp, where he spent 4 years among murderers, thieves, and other violent criminals. He expected to find that these men had been driven to crime by desperate circumstances or lack of proper education. Instead, he discovered that many of them had committed their crimes not out of necessity, but out of choice. Some seemed to enjoy violence for its own sake. Others appeared to have committed murder or robbery as a form of self-assertion or rebellion against social authority. Still, others seemed to have been motivated by a desire to experience the ultimate transgression, to see what it felt like to cross the line that separates civilized behavior from absolute barbarity. What disturbed Dostoevsky most was not that these men were evil, but that they were recognizably human. They were not monsters or beasts, but people who shared the same basic psychological makeup as everyone else. They had the same capacity for reason, emotion and moral understanding as law-abiding citizens. Many of them were intelligent, some were charming, and a few were even capable of genuine kindness in certain circumstances. But they had made fundamental choices about how to live that had led them down dark paths. If people like this could become violent criminals, then the potential for evil existed in everyone. This realization forced Dostoevsky to confront an uncomfortable truth about human nature. We are not blank slates who become good or evil depending on our environment. We are not rational calculators who always choose what serves our best interests. We are complex beings with contradictory impulses, including genuine impulses toward evil. Every human being contains the capacity for both sainthood and criminality. Which path we take depends not primarily on our circumstances, but on the moral choices we make in the depths of our souls. Dostoevsky explores this theme most powerfully through the character of Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. Raskolnikov is an intelligent, sensitive young man from a respectable family. He has received a good education and holds progressive social views. He is not driven to crime by poverty or desperation, though these factors play a role in his situation. Instead, he chooses to commit murder because he wants to prove to himself that he is an extraordinary individual who can transcend conventional morality. He has convinced himself through rational arguments that killing a worthless old woman and redistributing her money to deserving poor people would be a morally justified act. But Dostoevsky shows us that Raskolnikov's rational justifications are really elaborate self-deceptions. The real motivation for his crime is psychological rather than philosophical. He wants to experience the ultimate assertion of his own will and power. He wants to prove that he is not bound by the moral rules that constrain ordinary people. He wants to feel what it is like to hold the power of life and death over another human being. The murder is not really about helping the poor or serving some greater good. It is about feeding his own ego and satisfying his deepest psychological needs. What makes Raskolnikov so disturbing is that his psychological profile is not fundamentally different from that of many intellectuals and political activists. How many people have committed terrible acts in the name of serving humanity? How many revolutionaries have justified murder and terrorism by claiming to serve the greater good? How many ideologues have convinced themselves that their personal resentments and power drives are actually noble commitments to justice and progress? Raskolnikov represents the dangerous combination of intellectual sophistication and moral blindness that characterizes so many modern movements. He is the prototype of the educated person who uses rational arguments to justify fundamentally irrational and evil behavior. Dostoevsky also understood that evil often emerges not from dramatic moral failures, but from small compromises and gradual spiritual deterioration. Most people do not wake up one morning and decide to become criminals or tyrants. Instead, they make a series of seemingly minor moral compromises that slowly erode their capacity for ethical judgment. They tell small lies that prepare them for bigger lies. They rationalize minor selfishness that prepares them for major selfishness. They ignore small injustices that prepare them to participate in larger injustices. Over time, these compromises create a pattern of moral numbness that makes serious evil possible. This process is illustrated brilliantly in the brothers Karamazov through the character of Smerdyakov, who murders his father Fyodor. Smerdyakov is not born evil, but he grows up in an environment of moral corruption and cynicism. He observes the hypocrisy and selfishness of the adults around him, and he gradually learns to manipulate others for his own advantage. He develops a philosophy of nihilistic opportunism that justifies any action that serves his interests. By the time he commits murder, he has already lost any genuine capacity for moral feeling. The crime is simply the logical culmination of a lifelong process of spiritual deterioration. But Dostoevsky's most profound insight into the nature of evil concerns its relationship to freedom. Evil is not an unfortunate accident or a temporary aberration that can be eliminated through proper social engineering. Evil is an inevitable consequence of human freedom itself. If people are truly free to choose between good and evil, then some of them will choose evil. If people have the capacity for genuine love, then they also have the capacity for genuine hatred. If people can sacrifice themselves for others, then they can also sacrifice others for themselves. Freedom necessarily includes the freedom to choose wrongly, and this means that evil can never be completely eliminated from human existence. This does not mean that we should be passive in the face of evil, or that we should not work to reduce suffering and injustice. But it does mean that we should not expect to create perfect societies or eliminate the possibility of moral failure. Any political system that promises to end evil through social reform is either naive or dishonest. Any psychological theory that reduces evil to mental illness or social dysfunction is missing something essential about human nature. Any religious or philosophical system that tries to explain away the reality of genuine moral choice is denying the fundamental truth about what it means to be human. Dostoevsky also recognized that the attempt to eliminate evil often creates worse evils. When people become convinced that they can perfect human nature through rational planning, they often become willing to use extreme measures against those who resist their plans. If crime is caused by social conditions rather than individual choice, then criminals are not responsible for their actions and do not deserve punishment. But those who perpetuate the social conditions that cause crime become the real villains who deserve whatever fate the reformers choose to impose on them. This logic leads inevitably to the persecution of anyone who stands in the way of social progress. The attempt to create a perfect society ends up producing societies that are far more evil than the traditional societies they replace. The characters in Demons illustrate this process perfectly. They begin with genuine concerns about social injustice and a sincere desire to help the oppressed. But their commitment to revolutionary ideology gradually overwhelms their basic human decency. They become willing to lie, steal, and murder in service of their cause. They convince themselves that their personal hatred and resentment are actually noble commitment to justice. They end up becoming far more destructive than the social problems they originally set out to solve. Their attempt to eliminate evil from society has turned them into agents of evil themselves. The only realistic response to the problem of evil, according to Dostoevsky, is spiritual rather than political or social. We cannot eliminate evil through better institutions or improved education. We can only combat evil through individual moral and spiritual transformation. Each person must confront the capacity for evil within their own heart and choose to struggle against it. This struggle never ends and never achieves final victory in this life, but it is the only way to maintain our humanity in the face of the darkness that surrounds and pervades us. And occasionally, through grace and genuine repentance, it can lead to real redemption and transformation. Part 5. The Problem of Innocent Suffering and Ivan's Rebellion. No philosophical problem tormented Dostoevsky more deeply than the existence of innocent suffering. How can a loving and all-powerful God permit children to be tortured, abused, and killed? How can we believe in divine justice when the world is filled with undeserved pain and seemingly random cruelty? These questions strike at the very heart of religious faith and moral understanding. Most religious thinkers try to answer them with theological explanations about free will, the greater good, or the mysterious ways of divine providence. But Dostoevsky was too honest and too deeply acquainted with suffering to accept easy answers. Instead, he presented the problem of innocent suffering in its starkest and most emotionally devastating form. The most powerful statement of this problem comes through the character of Ivan Karamazov in The Brothers Karamazov. Ivan is a brilliant intellectual who has studied philosophy, theology, and history. He understands all the traditional arguments for the existence of God and the standard explanations for why a good God permits evil. But he has also collected stories of innocent children being tortured and murdered by adults. These stories are not abstract philosophical examples, but detailed accounts of real human suffering that Ivan has gathered from newspapers and historical records. When he confronts the reality of this suffering, all theological explanations collapse into meaninglessness. Ivan tells his brother Alyosha about a 5-year-old girl whose parents tortured her for minor infractions. They would beat her, lock her in an outhouse overnight in the freezing cold, and force her to eat her own excrement. The child would pray to God for protection, but no protection came. Eventually, her parents tortured her to death. Ivan asks Alyosha a simple but devastating question. Can you understand why a little creature who cannot even understand what is being done to her should beat her little heart with her tiny fist in the dark and cold, weeping tears to God for protection? And what can we say about a God who hears such prayers and does nothing? Ivan presents many such stories, each more heartbreaking than the last. A general orders his hunting dogs to tear apart a peasant boy because the child accidentally injured one of the general's favourite hounds. Turkish soldiers in Bulgaria entertain themselves by throwing babies into the air and catching them on their bayonets. Parents across the world beat, starve, and sexually abuse their own children, while the children cry out for help that never comes. These are not isolated incidents, but patterns of cruelty that have repeated themselves throughout human history. Every generation produces new examples of innocent suffering that seem to make a mockery of any belief in divine justice or cosmic meaning. The standard religious response to such suffering is to say that God works in mysterious ways that human beings cannot understand. Perhaps the suffering serves some greater purpose that will be revealed in the afterlife. Perhaps it is necessary for the development of human character or the achievement of some greater good. Perhaps the suffering will be compensated by eternal happiness in heaven. But Ivan rejects all such explanations as morally obscene. No greater good could possibly justify the torture of innocent children. No eternal compensation could make up for undeserved agony. If the achievement of some cosmic harmony requires even one child to suffer unjustly, then Ivan wants nothing to do with such harmony. Ivan presents his rejection of God's world in terms that are both logically rigorous and emotionally overwhelming. He tells Alyosha that he does not reject God himself, but he cannot accept the world that God has created. He refuses to participate in any cosmic plan that is built on the foundation of innocent suffering. Even if he could be shown that all suffering will eventually be justified and all injustice will be made right, he would still reject the ticket to such a universe. Some things are simply too precious to be sacrificed for any purpose, no matter how noble. The tears of a tortured child cannot be wiped away by any amount of future happiness or cosmic justice. This position is not atheism in the ordinary sense. Ivan is not arguing that God does not exist, or that religious claims are factually incorrect. He is making a moral argument against the universe itself. Even if God exists, and even if there is a divine plan that will ultimately make everything right, Ivan refuses to endorse such a plan. He would rather be damned than participate in a cosmic system that treats innocent suffering as an acceptable means to any end. This is rebellion not against God's existence, but against God's justice. Ivan's rebellion culminates in his famous parable of the Grand Inquisitor. In this story, Jesus returns to earth during the Spanish Inquisition and begins performing miracles and healing the sick. The Grand Inquisitor, who represents the highest authority of the Catholic Church, has Jesus arrested. He visits Jesus in his prison cell and explains why the Church must reject and execute him. The problem is that Jesus offered humanity freedom, but freedom is a burden that most people cannot bear. The Church has corrected Jesus' mistake by offering people security, certainty, and relief from the terrible responsibility of having to choose for themselves. The Grand Inquisitor argues that Jesus was wrong to reject the 3 temptations offered by Satan in the wilderness. Satan offered to turn stones into bread, representing the promise to solve human material needs. Jesus rejected this, insisting that people do not live by bread alone. But the Inquisitor points out that most people are not spiritual enough to care about anything beyond their physical survival. By refusing to solve the problem of hunger and poverty, Jesus condemned the majority of humanity to perpetual suffering. A truly loving God would have chosen to feed people rather than preserving their spiritual freedom. Satan also offered Jesus the chance to prove his divinity by throwing himself from the temple and having angels save him. This represents the power of miracle, the ability to compel belief through supernatural demonstrations. Jesus rejected this as well, insisting that faith must be freely chosen rather than forced through overwhelming evidence. But the Inquisitor argues that most people desperately want certainty and are tormented by doubt. By refusing to provide irrefutable proof of his divinity, Jesus left humanity to struggle with agonizing questions about the existence and nature of God. A truly compassionate God would have provided clear evidence that would eliminate all doubt and give people the security of certain knowledge. Finally, Satan offered Jesus dominion over all the kingdoms of the earth, representing the power to create perfect social and political institutions. Jesus rejected this as well, insisting that his kingdom was not of this world. But the Inquisitor argues that most people need strong leadership and clear social order to live decent lives. By refusing to establish a perfect earthly kingdom, Jesus left humanity to struggle with war, injustice, and political chaos. A truly wise God would have taken political power and used it to create conditions under which all people could live in peace and prosperity. The Grand Inquisitor concludes that the Church has corrected Jesus' mistakes by providing exactly what Satan offered and Jesus rejected. The Church feeds people through its charitable works, provides certainty through its doctrines and authority, and creates social order through its political influence. In doing so, it has made the vast majority of humanity much happier than they would have been under Jesus' original plan. Only a small number of spiritually exceptional individuals can handle the freedom that Jesus offered. For everyone else, freedom is a curse rather than a blessing. The Church has taken this burden upon itself and given people the security and happiness they actually want. This parable presents the problem of innocent suffering in its most sophisticated form. If God really loves humanity, why does he permit people to suffer when he has the power to prevent that suffering? The only possible answer seems to be that God values human freedom more than human happiness. But this means that God is willing to sacrifice the welfare of actual people for the sake of an abstract principle. Is this really love, or is it a form of cosmic cruelty dressed up in religious language? Ivan's rebellion forces us to confront the possibility that the universe itself is morally unacceptable. Dostoevsky does not provide easy answers to these devastating questions. He presents Ivan's arguments with complete intellectual honesty and emotional power. But he also shows us the human cost of Ivan's rebellion. Ivan's rejection of God's world leads him to a philosophy of nihilistic despair. If there is no cosmic justice, then there are no objective moral truths. If innocent suffering is meaningless, then all human striving is meaningless. If God does not care about human welfare, then perhaps nothing matters at all. Ivan's intellectual integrity leads him to conclusions that make life unbearable. The alternative to Ivan's rebellion is represented by his brother Alyosha, who accepts the mystery of innocent suffering without being able to explain it. Alyosha does not have better theological arguments than Ivan. He cannot provide satisfying explanations for why children suffer, but he chooses to trust in God's goodness despite the evidence that seems to contradict it. He responds to suffering not with intellectual analysis, but with practical love and compassion. He cannot solve the problem of evil, but he can work to reduce actual suffering in the lives of real people. His faith is not based on rational arguments, but on his direct experience of grace and redemption. Dostoevsky suggests that the problem of innocent suffering cannot be solved through philosophical reasoning. It can only be lived through and responded to with love. This does not make the suffering any less real or any less tragic, but it offers a way of maintaining both intellectual honesty and spiritual hope in the face of life's deepest mysteries. Part 6. The Grand Inquisitor and the Choice Between Freedom and Security. The Grand Inquisitor chapter. From the Brothers. Karamazov is perhaps the most powerful political parable ever written. In just a few pages, Dostoevsky managed to predict the rise of totalitarian movements, explain the psychological appeal of authoritarianism, and expose the fundamental tension between human freedom and human happiness. The parable takes the form of a story within a story, told by Ivan Karamazov to his brother Alyosha as part of his rebellion against God's world. But the implications of this story extend far beyond theology into the deepest questions of political philosophy and human nature. The setting is 16th century Spain during the height of the Inquisition. Jesus Christ has returned to earth and is walking through the streets of Seville, quietly performing miracles and comforting the suffering. The people recognize him immediately and begin to gather around him in wonder and hope. But the Grand Inquisitor, who represents the highest authority of the Catholic Church, observes this scene with alarm. He orders his guards to arrest Jesus and throw him into prison. That night the Inquisitor visits Jesus in his cell and delivers a long monologue explaining why the Church must reject and execute him. The Inquisitor's argument is both chilling and logically compelling. He acknowledges that Jesus is indeed who he claims to be and that his original teachings were authentic. But he argues that Jesus made a fundamental error in his understanding of human nature. Jesus offered humanity freedom, but freedom is a burden that most people cannot bear. The vast majority of human beings are weak, ignorant, and spiritually immature. They do not want the responsibility of making their own moral and spiritual choices. They want to be told what to believe, how to behave, and what their lives mean. They want security, certainty, and relief from the agonizing burden of having to think and choose for themselves. The Church, according to the Inquisitor, has corrected Jesus' mistake by giving people exactly what they actually want, rather than what Jesus thought they should want. Instead of demanding that people exercise their freedom to choose between good and evil, the Church has made the choice for them. Instead of requiring that people develop their own relationship with God through struggle and doubt, the Church has provided authoritative answers to all spiritual questions. Instead of leaving people to wrestle with moral ambiguity and uncertainty, the Church has given them clear rules that eliminate the need for difficult decisions. The result is a humanity that is much happier, more peaceful, and more unified than it would have been under Jesus' original plan. The Inquisitor supports his argument by reinterpreting the three temptations that Satan offered to Jesus in the wilderness. Each temptation represented a different aspect of what human beings actually need, and Jesus' rejection of these temptations demonstrated his fundamental misunderstanding of human nature. The first temptation was to turn stones into bread, representing the promise to solve material need and economic inequality. Jesus rejected this, saying that people do not live by bread alone. But the Inquisitor points out that most people are primarily concerned with their physical survival and comfort. They cannot focus on spiritual matters when they are hungry, homeless, or economically insecure. By refusing to solve the problem of material want, Jesus condemned the majority of humanity to lives dominated by anxiety about their basic needs. The second temptation was to throw himself from the temple and have angels save him, demonstrating his divine nature through an undeniable miracle. This represented the power to compel belief through overwhelming evidence. Jesus rejected this as well, insisting that faith must be freely chosen, rather than forced through supernatural demonstration. But the Inquisitor argues that most people are tormented by doubt and desperately want certainty. They cannot handle the ambiguity and uncertainty that comes with freely chosen faith. They need clear, undeniable evidence that will eliminate their doubts and give them the security of certain knowledge. By refusing to provide such evidence, Jesus left humanity to struggle with agonizing questions about the existence and nature of God. The third temptation was the offer of dominion over all the kingdoms of the earth, representing the power to create perfect political and social institutions. Jesus rejected this as well, insisting that his kingdom was not of this world. But the Inquisitor argues that most people need strong leadership and clear social organization to live decent lives. They cannot handle the chaos and conflict that comes with political freedom. They need authoritarian institutions that will make decisions for them and protect them from the consequences of their own poor judgment. By refusing to establish a perfect earthly kingdom, Jesus left humanity to struggle with war, injustice, and social disorder. The Grand Inquisitor concludes that Satan understood human nature better than Jesus did. Satan offered exactly what most people actually want and need. Bread represents economic security and material comfort. Miracle represents certainty and the elimination of doubt. Authority represents strong leadership and relief from the burden of self-governance. The Church has embraced all three of these gifts and used them to create a system that makes the vast majority of humanity much happier than they would have been under Jesus' original plan. The Inquisitor claims that this system is actually more loving and compassionate than what Jesus offered. Jesus' plan would have worked well for the small minority of human beings who are spiritually strong enough to handle freedom, uncertainty, and moral responsibility. But it would have been a disaster for everyone else. The Church has taken pity on the weak masses and given them what they actually need rather than what they theoretically should want. This required the Church to sacrifice its own spiritual purity and take upon itself the burden of making difficult decisions for others. The Church leaders know that they will be damned for corrupting Jesus' original message, but they are willing to bear this cost out of love for humanity. This argument is terrifying because it contains enough truth to be plausible. How many people really want the responsibility of making their own moral and spiritual choices? How many people would rather have economic security than economic freedom? How many people would rather have certainty than truth if the two conflict? How many people would rather have strong leaders making decisions for them than have to participate in the messy and difficult process of democratic governance? The Inquisitor's vision of humanity is cynical, but it is not obviously false. Dostoevsky wrote this parable decades before the rise of fascism and communism, but it perfectly describes the appeal of totalitarian movements. Both fascist and communist regimes offered their populations exactly what the Grand Inquisitor promised. They promised to solve economic problems through centralized planning and state control. They promised certainty through official ideology that would answer all questions and eliminate doubt. They promised strong leadership that would make all important decisions and relieve ordinary people of political responsibility. And millions of people embraced these systems precisely because they offered relief from the burden of freedom. The parable also explains why democratic societies are always fragile, and why freedom is always in danger of being lost. Democracy requires citizens to educate themselves about complex issues, make difficult choices, and accept responsibility for the consequences of their decisions. This is hard work that many people would rather avoid. It is much easier to let someone else make the decisions and then blame them when things go wrong. It is much more comfortable to have clear ideological answers than to wrestle with ambiguous questions that have no easy solutions. The appeal of authoritarianism is not primarily economic or political, but psychological. It offers relief from the existential burden of being free. But Dostoevsky does not end the parable with the Inquisitor's monologue. After listening silently to the entire argument, Jesus responds not with words, but with a simple action. He approaches the old Inquisitor and gently kisses him on his aged lips. This kiss contains no argument, no refutation, no explanation. It is simply an expression of love for a human being who has lost his way. The Inquisitor is deeply moved by this gesture, but he does not change his mind. He releases Jesus and tells him never to return. Jesus leaves in silence, and the Inquisitor continues with his work of managing humanity for its own good. This ending suggests that the choice between freedom and security cannot be resolved through rational argument. Both positions have compelling logic behind them. The choice ultimately comes down to a fundamental decision about what human beings are and what they are capable of becoming. Jesus represents faith in human potential and the belief that freedom is worth the cost it requires. The Inquisitor represents compassionate realism about human limitations and the belief that most people need protection from their own freedom. Each position contains both truth and error, and the tension between them can never be completely resolved. What Dostoevsky shows us is that this choice is always before us, both individually and collectively. We can choose the path of freedom with all its risks, uncertainties and painful responsibilities. Or we can choose the path of security with all its comforts, certainties and protected dependencies. Neither choice is obviously right or wrong, and both exact a price from those who make them. But the choice itself cannot be avoided, and the consequences of our choice will shape not only our own lives, but the lives of future generations. Part 7. Russian Orthodox Christianity versus Western religion. For Dostoevsky, the conflict between different forms of Christianity was not merely a theological dispute, but a battle for the soul of humanity itself. He believed that Western Christianity, both Catholic and Protestant, had fundamentally betrayed the original message of Christ. In pursuing worldly power, intellectual respectability and social influence, Western churches had lost touch with the spiritual essence of Christian faith. Only Russian orthodoxy, he argued, had preserved the authentic Christian spirit of humility, suffering, and mystical union with God. This was not mere nationalist prejudice, but a carefully developed philosophical and theological position that shaped his entire worldview. Dostoevsky's critique of Roman Catholicism was particularly harsh and uncompromising. He saw the Catholic Church as the direct descendant of the Roman Empire, more concerned with political power than spiritual truth. The Church had corrupted Christ's message by trying to create an earthly kingdom rather than focusing on the kingdom of heaven. It had replaced the spiritual authority of love and humility with the temporal authority of law and coercion. It had substituted rational theology for mystical experience and bureaucratic organization for authentic spiritual community. In Dostoevsky's view, Catholicism represented everything that Christ had rejected during his 3 temptations in the wilderness. The Grand Inquisitor was Dostoevsky's symbolic representation of Catholic Christianity. The Inquisitor genuinely believes that he is serving humanity by taking away the terrible burden of spiritual freedom. He has convinced himself that most people are too weak and ignorant to handle the responsibility of making their own religious choices. Therefore, the Church must make these choices for them, providing clear doctrines, absolute authority, and relief from spiritual uncertainty. This is presented as an act of compassion, but Dostoevsky saw it as a fundamental betrayal of Christ's message. By removing freedom, the Church had also removed the possibility of genuine faith, love, and spiritual growth. Dostoevsky argued that this corruption of Christianity was not accidental, but inevitable, given Catholic theology and institutional structure. The Catholic emphasis on papal authority and church tradition had replaced the direct personal relationship between the individual believer and God. The development of sophisticated theological systems had replaced simple faith with intellectual complexity. The accumulation of worldly wealth and political power had corrupted the Church's spiritual mission. The result was a form of Christianity that was Christian in name only, having lost the essential spirit that made Christianity revolutionary and transformative. Protestantism, in Dostoevsky's view, was even worse than Catholicism because it carried the logic of Western Christianity to its ultimate conclusion. By rejecting papal authority and church tradition, Protestants had opened the door to complete individualism and relativism. If every believer could interpret Scripture for themselves, then there was no objective religious truth at all. If salvation came through faith alone, rather than through participation in a spiritual community, then religion became a purely private matter with no social or cultural significance. Protestantism had inadvertently prepared the way for secularization by making religion optional and subjective. It was a transitional phase between traditional Christianity and complete atheism. Dostoevsky saw socialism as the logical culmination of both Catholic and Protestant eras. Socialism promised to create the perfect, earthly society that Catholicism had sought through church authority and political power. It offered the individual liberation that Protestantism had promised through rejection of external authority. But it achieved both goals by eliminating God entirely and putting human reason and human will in God's place. Socialism was the final form of the Western Christian heresy, the attempt to create heaven on earth through human effort rather than divine grace. It retained the Christian concern for justice and equality while rejecting the Christian understanding of human nature and divine providence. Against all these Western deviations, Dostoevsky held up Russian Orthodoxy as the true embodiment of Christian faith. Orthodoxy had never sought worldly power or tried to create earthly kingdoms. It had preserved the mystical and contemplative dimensions of Christianity that Western churches had lost in their pursuit of rational theology and social influence. Orthodox believers understood that the spiritual life was primarily about suffering, humility and union with God, rather than about intellectual understanding or moral achievement. They recognized that the Church was a community of sinners seeking redemption, rather than an institution of saints dispensing salvation. They maintained the primitive Christian understanding that this world was fallen and that ultimate hope lay in the world to come. The Orthodox emphasis on suffering was particularly important to Dostoevsky's religious philosophy. While Western Christianity often tried to minimize or explain away the reality of suffering, Orthodoxy embraced suffering as an essential part of the spiritual path. Through suffering, believers learned compassion for others who suffer. Through suffering, they were purified of pride, selfishness, and illusion. Through suffering, they participated in Christ's own passion and came to understand the mystery of redemption. Suffering was not an unfortunate accident to be eliminated, but a sacred opportunity for spiritual growth and transformation. This understanding of suffering was connected to the Orthodox concept of kenosis, the self-emptying love that Christ demonstrated in his incarnation and crucifixion. True Christian love required the complete surrender of self-will and the willingness to sacrifice everything for the good of others. This was not mere altruism or humanitarian concern, but a mystical participation in God's own love for creation. Such love could not be achieved through moral effort or intellectual understanding, but only through grace received in the context of genuine spiritual community. It required the kind of humility and self-surrender that Western individualism made almost impossible to achieve. Dostoevsky illustrated these orthodox principles through characters like Alyosha Karamazov, Prince Mishkin and Father Zosima. These characters embody the Orthodox ideal of holy simplicity, combining deep spiritual wisdom with childlike innocence. They do not rely on theological arguments or moral reasoning to guide their actions. Instead, they respond to each situation with spontaneous love and compassion, trusting that God will work through their simple faithfulness. They are willing to suffer for others and to forgive even the most terrible wrongs. They see Christ in every human being, no matter how degraded or sinful that person might appear. But Dostoevsky did not present these orthodox ideals in a naive or sentimental way. Characters like Prince Mishkin often appear foolish or ineffective by worldly standards. Their goodness does not always produce good results, and their love does not always heal the people they try to help. Sometimes their very innocence becomes a source of suffering for themselves and others. Dostoevsky understood that Orthodox Christianity offered no guarantee of worldly success or even personal happiness. What it offered was the possibility of spiritual authenticity and ultimate meaning in the face of a world that often seemed meaningless and absurd. The political implications of this religious vision were profound and disturbing to Western readers. If Russian Orthodoxy represented true Christianity, then Russia had a messianic mission to save the world from Western materialism and spiritual corruption. Russian civilization, despite all its obvious problems and failures, was spiritually superior to Western civilization because it had preserved the authentic Christian spirit. The Russian people, despite their poverty and backwardness, were closer to God than the educated and prosperous peoples of Western Europe. This vision combined genuine religious insight with dangerous nationalist fantasy in ways that would have terrible consequences for both Russia and the world. Dostoevsky believed that the final spiritual battle of human history would be fought between Russian orthodoxy and Western secularism. Either the world would embrace the orthodox understanding of suffering, humility, and mystical union with God, or it would complete its descent into materialism, atheism, and spiritual darkness. There was no middle ground between these alternatives. The choice was between Christ and Antichrist, between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of man, between salvation and damnation. In this cosmic struggle, Russia was destined to play the role of the suffering servant who would redeem the world through its willingness to bear the pain that others refused to accept. This religious nationalism was both the strength and the weakness of Dostoevsky's spiritual vision. It gave him profound insights into the spiritual emptiness of modern secular culture and the psychological appeal of various forms of religious and political fanaticism. But it also led him to idealize Russian culture and Orthodox Christianity in ways that ignored their obvious limitations and failures. The Russia that Dostoevsky loved was more a spiritual symbol than a historical reality. The orthodoxy he championed was more an ideal than an actual institutional church. His religious philosophy was powerful and moving, but it was also dangerous when translated into political action. Part 8. Love as the Ultimate Reality and Redemptive Force. At the deepest level of Dostoevsky's philosophy lies a simple but revolutionary claim. Love is not merely one human emotion among others, not merely a psychological drive or social bond. Love is the fundamental force that holds the universe together, the ultimate reality behind all appearances, the final answer to every philosophical question. This is not the sentimental love celebrated in popular culture, nor the rational benevolence advocated by moral philosophers. It is a cosmic principle, that manifests itself most clearly in suffering, sacrifice, and the willingness to bear the pain of others. For Dostoevsky, love in this ultimate sense is identical with God, and the capacity for such love is what makes human beings capable of redemption. This understanding of love emerged from Dostoevsky's own experience of suffering and spiritual transformation. During his years in the Siberian prison camp, he witnessed the worst aspects of human nature, but also moments of unexpected compassion and self-sacrifice. He saw hardened criminals risk their lives to help fellow prisoners. He observed acts of kindness that had no rational explanation or practical benefit. He experienced moments when the barriers between self and other seemed to dissolve, and he felt a profound connection to all suffering humanity. These experiences convinced him that beneath the surface of human cruelty and selfishness lay a deeper reality of universal love that could transform even the most degraded souls. But Dostoevsky's concept of love was paradoxical and often difficult to understand. True love, he believed, could only emerge through the complete acceptance of suffering. Those who tried to avoid pain, either for themselves or others, could never develop the spiritual depth necessary for genuine love. Those who sought happiness and pleasure as their primary goals would remain trapped in selfishness and superficiality. Only those who were willing to embrace suffering as a path to spiritual growth could transcend their ego boundaries and participate in the universal love that connected all beings. This meant that love often looked like its opposite, appearing as tragedy, loss, and heartbreak rather than joy and fulfillment. Dostoevsky illustrated this paradox through characters who embodied different aspects of love and its absence. Prince Mishkin in The Idiot represents pure, innocent love that seeks nothing for itself and gives everything to others. But Mishkin's love is tragic because it cannot protect him or those he loves from suffering. His very goodness becomes a source of destruction because the world is not prepared to receive such unconditional love. Yet Dostoevsky suggests that Mishkin's apparent failure is actually a form of success because his love plants seeds that may bear fruit in the future. Even when love cannot prevent suffering, it can transform the meaning of that suffering and point toward ultimate redemption. Alyosha Karamazov represents a more mature and practical form of love that has learned to work within the limitations of human nature and social reality. Alyosha does not try to save everyone or solve all problems through the sheer force of his goodness. Instead, he responds to each person and situation with specific acts of compassion that are appropriate to the circumstances. He listens without judging, forgives without conditions, and helps without expecting gratitude or recognition. His love is quiet and undemonstrative, but it has a transformative effect on almost everyone he encounters. Through Alyosha, Dostoevsky shows how love can be both completely selfless and completely practical. The contrast between these loving characters and those who lack love reveals the central tragedy of human existence. Characters like Raskolnikov, Ivan Karamazov, and the underground man are capable of brilliant intellectual analysis and profound emotional sensitivity. But they are trapped in their own subjectivity and cannot break through to genuine connection with others. Their intelligence becomes a prison that separates them from the spontaneous flow of life and love. They understand everything except the most important thing, which is how to love and be loved. Their tragedy is not that they are evil, but that they are isolated from the source of all meaning and joy. Dostoevsky believed that this isolation was the fundamental problem of modern civilization. Rationalism, individualism, and materialism had taught people to view themselves as separate atoms competing for scarce resources in an indifferent universe. This worldview made genuine love almost impossible because it was based on the assumption that self-interest and altruism were fundamentally opposed. People could cooperate when it served their mutual interests, but they could not love in the ultimate sense because they could not transcend their ego boundaries. The result was a civilization that was technologically advanced but spiritually impoverished, capable of great achievements but incapable of genuine happiness or meaning. The alternative to this modern predicament was what Dostoevsky called sobornost, a Russian Orthodox concept that refers to spiritual unity achieved through love. Sobornost is not mere cooperation or social solidarity, but a mystical participation in the divine love that connects all beings. When people experience sobornost, they discover that their deepest interests are not separate from the interests of others, but identical with them. They realize that the boundaries between self and other are illusions created by ego, and that true fulfillment comes through self-transcendence rather than self-assertion. This realization cannot be achieved through intellectual effort or moral willpower, but only through grace received in the context of genuine spiritual community. Father Zosima in The Brothers. Karamazov embodies this ideal of sobornost and serves as Dostoevsky's most complete representation of how love transforms human consciousness. Zosima teaches that every human being is responsible for everyone else, and that all suffering is shared suffering. When one person sins, all humanity is diminished. When one person is redeemed, all humanity is lifted up. This interconnectedness is not a moral obligation imposed from outside, but a spiritual reality that becomes visible to those who have learned to love truly. Zosima can see Christ in every person, because he has transcended the ego boundaries that normally separate people from each other. But Dostoevsky was too honest and too experienced with human nature to present love as an easy solution to human problems. True love requires enormous sacrifice and often leads to what appears to be failure and defeat. Those who love most deeply often suffer most intensely because they open themselves to the pain of others as well as their own pain. Love does not eliminate evil or prevent tragedy. It transforms the meaning of evil and tragedy by placing them in the context of ultimate redemption. This transformation is real and profound, but it often invisible to those who judge by worldly standards of success and failure. Dostoevsky also understood that love could be corrupted and perverted in various ways. Possessive love that tries to control and manipulate others is not love at all, but a form of disguised selfishness. Sentimental love that refuses to confront reality and make difficult choices is actually a form of self-indulgence. Ideological love that claims to serve humanity while ignoring the needs of actual individual people is a form of dangerous fanaticism. True love requires wisdom, courage, and the willingness to accept responsibility for the consequences of one's actions. It is the most difficult and demanding of all human activities, which is why so few people ever achieve it fully. The ultimate test of love, according to Dostoevsky, is forgiveness. Anyone can love those who are kind, attractive, and deserving. But only those who have been transformed by grace can love their enemies, forgive those who have hurt them, and see the divine image in those who appear to be completely evil. This kind of forgiveness is not merely an ethical choice, but a spiritual recognition that all human beings share the same fundamental nature, despite their surface differences. Those who can forgive in this ultimate sense have moved beyond the ordinary categories of justice and injustice to participate in the divine perspective that sees all beings as equally precious and equally in need of redemption. Dostoevsky believed that the capacity for such love and forgiveness was the ultimate mark of human dignity and the final answer to all philosophical questions about the meaning and purpose of existence. Those who achieved this level of spiritual development became channels through which divine love could enter the world and transform it. They could not eliminate suffering or solve all human problems, but they could change the spiritual atmosphere in which those problems existed. Their presence reminded others of possibilities they had forgotten and hopes they had abandoned. Through their example, the impossible became possible and the kingdom of heaven became present even in the midst of earthly hell. Part 9. The Prophecy of Totalitarianism. Writing in the 1870s, decades before the rise of fascism and communism, Dostoevsky predicted with astonishing accuracy how totalitarian movements would operate and why they would appeal to millions of people. In his novel Demons, he created a prophetic vision of revolutionary terrorism that anticipated the tactics and psychology of 20th century political extremism. But his insight went deeper than mere political prediction. He understood the spiritual and psychological roots of totalitarianism and why modern civilization was inevitably moving toward unprecedented forms of tyranny. His warnings were ignored by most of his contemporaries, who viewed his political novels as hysterical overreactions to minor social problems. History proved that Dostoevsky was not hysterical enough. The central insight behind Dostoevsky's political prophecy was his understanding that totalitarianism emerges not from traditional authoritarianism, but from the collapse of traditional beliefs and institutions. Traditional tyrants claimed authority based on divine right, inherited legitimacy, or military conquest. They ruled through fear and force, but they did not typically try to control every aspect of their subjects' lives or reshape human nature itself. Modern totalitarianism, by contrast, emerges from democratic and egalitarian movements that claim to represent the will of the people and the march of historical progress. Totalitarian leaders present themselves not as conquerors, but as servants of humanity, who are working to eliminate suffering and create perfect societies. This makes their tyranny far more dangerous and more difficult to resist than traditional despotism. Dostoevsky saw that this new form of tyranny would emerge from the philosophical ideas that were gaining popularity among European intellectuals. Materialism taught that human beings were nothing more than complex machines governed by physical and social laws. If this were true, then human behavior could be predicted and controlled through the proper manipulation of environmental conditions. Rationalism taught that reason could solve all human problems and create perfect social institutions. If this were true, then those who possessed superior rational knowledge had the right and obligation to impose their plans on everyone else. Atheism taught that there were no objective moral truths or transcendent sources of meaning. If this were true, then moral values were simply human constructions that could be changed at will to serve political purposes. The combination of these ideas created a perfect intellectual foundation for totalitarian politics. If human beings were merely biological machines, then they had no inherent dignity or rights that would limit what could be done to them in service of social goals. If reason was the only legitimate source of authority, then intellectuals and planners had the right to override the preferences and traditions of ordinary people. If moral values were arbitrary social constructions, then any action could be justified if it served the supposedly rational goals of the revolutionary movement. These ideas, which seem progressive and humane to 19th century liberals, contained the seeds of unprecedented cruelty and oppression. In Demons, Dostoevsky illustrated how these abstract philosophical ideas would translate into concrete political action. The novel's revolutionary characters begin with genuine concern about social injustice and sincere desire to help the oppressed. But their commitment to ideological purity gradually overwhelms their basic human decency and moral sense. They become willing to lie, steal and murder in service of their cause because they have convinced themselves that their personal feelings and moral scruples are obstacles to the greater good. They develop elaborate theoretical justifications for actions that they would have considered obviously evil before their ideological conversion. The result is a form of evil that is far more dangerous than traditional criminality because it operates with a clear conscience and claims moral legitimacy. Dostoevsky understood that this kind of ideological fanaticism would appeal particularly to educated young people who had lost traditional religious faith but retained the need for meaning and purpose. Revolutionary movements offered these individuals a sense of mission and significance that secular culture could not provide. By joining a cause that promised to transform the world, they could feel that their lives mattered in some ultimate sense. By identifying with the supposedly inevitable march of historical progress, they could feel that they were on the winning side of a cosmic struggle between good and evil. By embracing an ideology that explained everything and promised to solve all problems, they could escape from the uncertainty and ambiguity that characterized modern life. Revolutionary movements functioned as substitute religions for people who could no longer believe in traditional religions. But Dostoevsky also saw that these movements would inevitably betray their own ideals and become tyrannical. The same philosophical assumptions that justified revolutionary violence against the old order would eventually justify tyrannical control over the new order. If human beings were rational machines, then they could be programmed to behave in socially beneficial ways. If traditional moral values were obstacles to progress, then people would need to be re-educated to accept new values. If individual preferences conflicted with collective goals, then individual preferences would have to be suppressed for the greater good. The logic that justified revolution would inevitably lead to totalitarian control once the revolutionaries gained power. The character of Shigalov in Demons represents this progression from revolutionary idealism to totalitarian planning. Shigalov begins with the goal of creating perfect equality and freedom for all humanity. But when he works out the practical implications of his ideas, he discovers that perfect equality requires the complete elimination of individual freedom. His ideal society would divide humanity into two groups: a small elite who would make all decisions, and a large mass who would live in conditions of perfect equality but complete subservience. Shigalov presents this not as a betrayal of his original ideals, but as their logical fulfillment. True freedom and equality, he argues, can only be achieved through the elimination of the false freedom and equality that allows some people to dominate others. This paradox runs through all totalitarian movements. They promise liberation, but deliver enslavement. They claim to serve the people, but end up treating the people as raw material for their social engineering projects. They begin with humanitarian goals, but end up committing atrocities that surpass anything achieved by traditional tyrants. This is not an accidental corruption of originally good intentions, but the inevitable result of the philosophical assumptions on which these movements are based. Any political philosophy that denies human dignity, transcendent moral truth, and the mystery of human nature will eventually produce tyrannical results. Dostoevsky also predicted that totalitarian movements would use terror not merely as a practical tool for gaining and maintaining power, but as a psychological technique for transforming human consciousness. Terror serves to break down traditional social bonds and moral inhibitions that might interfere with ideological conformity. When people live in constant fear of denunciation and punishment, they learn to suppress their own thoughts and feelings and adopt whatever attitudes the regime demands. They become psychologically dependent on the very system that oppresses them because it provides the only source of security and meaning in their devastated lives. Terror does not merely force external compliance, it reshapes the inner life of its victims in ways that make genuine resistance almost impossible. The novel's most chilling scenes involve the psychological manipulation and destruction of individuals who initially resist the revolutionary movement. The characters are not simply killed or imprisoned, but systematically broken down through a combination of ideological pressure, social isolation, and carefully orchestrated psychological torture. Their resistance is not overcome through rational argument, but through the deliberate destruction of their capacity for independent thought and moral judgment. They are transformed from free individuals into instruments of the movement's will. This process anticipates the sophisticated techniques of psychological manipulation that would be developed by 20th-century totalitarian regimes. But Dostoevsky's most profound insight concerns the religious dimension of totalitarian movements. These movements are not merely political, but essentially religious in nature, offering their adherents a comprehensive worldview that explains everything and promises ultimate salvation. They demand not merely obedience but faith, not merely compliance but enthusiastic participation in their sacred mission. They create their own rituals, martyrs, and sacred texts that function exactly like religious institutions. They promise their followers immortality through identification with the movement and its supposedly eternal goals. This religious dimension makes totalitarian movements far more powerful and persistent than purely political tyrannies, because they satisfy deep spiritual needs that secular culture cannot address. The ultimate horror of totalitarianism, according to Dostoevsky, is not that it makes people miserable, but that it makes them satisfied with their misery. By destroying their capacity for independent thought and authentic feeling, totalitarian systems create populations of people who genuinely believe that their oppression is freedom and their degradation is dignity. They lose the ability to imagine alternatives to their condition and become psychologically incapable of genuine rebellion. This represents the complete triumph of evil, because it eliminates not merely the reality of goodness, but even the memory of what goodness might look like. It is the final victory of the Grand Inquisitor's vision over the vision of Christ. Part 10. The Birth of Existentialism and the Divided Self. Long before existentialism became a recognized philosophical movement, Dostoevsky had identified and dramatized its central insights. Through characters like the underground man, Raskolnikov, and Ivan Karamazov, he explored themes that would later become the foundation of existentialist thought: the absurdity of existence, the burden of freedom, the anxiety of choice, and the search for authentic selfhood in a meaningless universe. But Dostoevsky's existentialism was different from the secular existentialism that would emerge in the 20th century, because it was grounded in a profound spiritual struggle rather than a rejection of all spiritual possibilities. For Dostoevsky, the confrontation with meaninglessness was not the end of the philosophical journey, but the beginning of a deeper search for transcendent meaning. The underground man represents the first fully developed existentialist hero in literature. He is acutely aware that his existence precedes any essence or meaning that he might try to impose upon it. He knows that he is radically free to choose who he wants to be, but he also knows that this freedom is a terrible burden that most people try to escape. He understands that all human values and institutions are human constructions rather than objective features of reality. He recognizes that reason cannot provide ultimate guidance for human action, because reason itself is just another human tool with no transcendent authority. These insights anticipate the central themes of existentialist philosophy by several decades. But the underground man's response to these insights is profoundly different from that of later existentialist thinkers. Instead of embracing his freedom and creating his own values, he becomes paralyzed by the recognition of his radical responsibility for his choices. Instead of affirming life despite its apparent meaninglessness, he retreats into bitter isolation and self-destructive behavior. Instead of finding authenticity through the acceptance of anxiety and uncertainty, he becomes consumed by resentment and spite. The underground man shows us what happens when existentialist insights are divorced from any spiritual or transcendent framework that could give them positive meaning. Without God, or some other source of objective value, existential freedom becomes a curse rather than a blessing. Dostoevsky's exploration of the divided self was equally prophetic and influential. His characters are not unified personalities, but complex battlegrounds where conflicting impulses, beliefs and desires struggle for dominance. Raskolnikov contains both a potential saint and a potential criminal, and his actions emerge from the temporary victory of one aspect of his personality over others. Ivan Karamazov is simultaneously a believer and an atheist, capable of profound religious insight and equally profound religious rebellion. The underground man is both a penetrating social critic and a pathetic failure who cannot apply his insights to his own life. These characters anticipate the modern psychological understanding of personality as multiple and contradictory rather than single and coherent. This division of the self creates what existentialists would later call authenticity problems. If we contain multiple conflicting selves, which one represents our true identity? If our conscious thoughts and stated values conflict with our unconscious drives and actual behavior, which should we trust? If we can observe ourselves thinking and feeling, who is the observer and who is the observed? These questions torment Dostoevsky's characters and drive them to increasingly desperate attempts to achieve some kind of unified selfhood. But their efforts usually fail because the division is built into the structure of human consciousness itself. Dostoevsky understood that this divided consciousness was both a burden and an opportunity. The same self-awareness that makes authentic action difficult also makes moral growth possible. The same capacity for self-observation that creates anxiety and paralysis also enables genuine self-knowledge and repentance. The same freedom that allows people to choose evil also allows them to choose good. The divided self is the price we pay for being human, but it is also what makes genuine humanity possible. Without the capacity to step outside ourselves and observe our own thoughts and actions, we would be no different from animals acting on instinct. The existential themes in Dostoevsky's work also include a profound exploration of what would later be called bad faith, the tendency to deny one's freedom and responsibility by pretending to be determined by external forces. Many of his characters try to escape the burden of choice by convincing themselves that their actions are determined by their social circumstances, their psychological makeup, or their philosophical beliefs. Raskolnikov claims that his murder was justified by his theory about extraordinary individuals, but this is really an attempt to avoid taking full responsibility for his free choice to kill. The underground man blames his problems on social conditions and psychological determinism, but this is really an excuse for his refusal to take positive action to improve his life. These characters demonstrate how easy it is to use sophisticated intellectual analysis as a way of avoiding genuine moral responsibility. But Dostoevsky also shows us characters who achieve what existentialists would call authentic existence by fully accepting their freedom and responsibility. Alyosha Karamazov does not try to escape the burden of choice by appealing to external authorities or deterministic explanations. He takes full responsibility for his actions and their consequences while remaining open to grace and guidance from beyond himself. Sonia Marmeladova in Crime and Punishment freely chooses to sacrifice herself for her family while maintaining her dignity and moral integrity. These characters show that authenticity is possible, but it requires enormous courage and spiritual strength. It cannot be achieved through intellectual analysis alone, but requires a fundamental transformation of one's relationship to existence itself. The existential dimension of Dostoevsky's work is most clearly visible in his treatment of death and mortality. His characters are constantly aware that they will die, and that this fact renders all their projects and concerns ultimately meaningless from a cosmic perspective. This awareness of mortality creates both anxiety and urgency. If life is short and death is certain, then every choice matters enormously because there may not be opportunities to correct mistakes or try alternative paths. But if death makes everything meaningless, then no choice matters at all, because all outcomes lead to the same ultimate destination. This paradox creates the existential tension that drives much of the psychological drama in Dostoevsky's novels. Prince Myshkin in The Idiot embodies a unique response to this existential situation. His epilepsy gives him direct experience of what he believes to be the eternal moment that exists beyond time and death. This experience allows him to live with complete presence and authenticity, because he has seen that temporal existence is not the only reality. But his knowledge also makes him unable to function effectively in ordinary social reality, because he cannot take seriously the things that most people consider important. Myshkin represents both the possibility and the cost of transcending the normal existential predicament. His authenticity comes at the price of practical effectiveness and ordinary human happiness. Dostoevsky's influence on later existentialist thinkers was enormous, though often unacknowledged. Kierkegaard, who is usually considered the father of existentialism, was deeply influenced by Dostoevsky's exploration of anxiety, despair, and the leap of faith. Nietzsche's concept of the overman and his critique of conventional morality owe much to characters like Raskolnikov and Ivan Karamazov. Sartre's analysis of bad faith and the burden of freedom clearly draws on insights that Dostoevsky dramatized decades earlier. Camus' treatment of the absurd and the rebel shows the influence of characters like the underground man and Ivan Karamazov. Even Heidegger's analysis of authentic existence and being toward death reflects themes that Dostoevsky explored in psychological rather than philosophical terms. But Dostoevsky's existentialism differed fundamentally from most later versions because it remained open to religious and spiritual possibilities. While 20th century existentialists typically assumed that God was dead and that humans had to create meaning entirely through their own efforts, Dostoevsky saw the confrontation with meaninglessness as a necessary step toward authentic religious faith. His characters who achieve genuine authenticity do so not by rejecting all transcendent possibilities, but by moving through despair to a deeper level of spiritual understanding. For Dostoevsky, existential honesty about the human condition was not incompatible with religious faith, but actually required such faith to avoid falling into nihilistic despair. This religious dimension of his existentialism makes his work more hopeful and ultimately more humane than much of the existentialist literature that followed. Part 11. The Psychology of the Unconscious and Human Motivation. Decades before Sigmund Freud developed psychoanalysis, Dostoevsky had already mapped the unconscious territories of the human mind with unprecedented precision and insight. His novels function as case studies in psychological analysis, revealing the hidden drives, repressed desires, and unconscious conflicts that motivate human behavior. Freud himself acknowledged this debt, ranking Dostoevsky second only to Shakespeare in literary achievement and declaring that the Russian novelist had anticipated many of the central discoveries of psychoanalytic theory. But Dostoevsky's psychological insights went beyond anything that academic psychology would achieve because they were grounded in direct observation of human nature under extreme conditions rather than theoretical speculation. Dostoevsky understood that human beings are driven by forces that operate below the level of conscious awareness. People rarely act for the reasons they claim to act, and they often pursue goals that directly contradict their stated values and rational interests. Raskolnikov tells himself that he commits murder to help the poor and test his theory about extraordinary individuals, but the real motivation is his need to assert power and overcome his sense of personal inadequacy. The underground man claims that he withdraws from society because other people are inferior and unworthy of his attention, but the real reason is his terror of rejection and his inability to risk genuine human connection. Ivan Karamazov develops elaborate philosophical arguments against God's existence, but his atheism is really driven by his emotional inability to accept a world in which innocent children suffer. In each case, the conscious explanation serves to hide rather than reveal the true psychological dynamics at work. This insight into the divided nature of human motivation was revolutionary in its implications. If people do not understand their own motivations, then rational arguments and moral exhortations are largely useless for changing behavior. If unconscious drives are more powerful than conscious intentions, then social reform efforts that appeal only to reason and self-interest are doomed to failure. If psychological conflicts operate outside the realm of voluntary control, then traditional approaches to criminal justice and moral education need to be fundamentally reconsidered. Dostoevsky's psychological realism challenged every assumption about human nature that was common in his time, and continues to challenge many assumptions that are common today. Dostoevsky was particularly brilliant in his analysis of what psychologists would later call defense mechanisms, the unconscious strategies that people use to protect themselves from painful truths about their own nature and circumstances. Rationalization allows people to create logical explanations for behavior that is actually driven by irrational emotional needs. Projection allows people to attribute their own unacceptable impulses to others rather than acknowledging them in themselves. Denial allows people to refuse to see obvious realities that would force them to change their self-image or behavior. Compensation allows people to excel in one area as a way of making up for felt inadequacies in another area. Sublimation allows people to channel antisocial impulses into socially acceptable activities. Dostoevsky's characters demonstrate all of these mechanisms with psychological accuracy that would not be matched by academic psychology for decades. The underground man is perhaps the most psychologically complex character in all of literature because he is simultaneously the subject and object of psychological analysis. He understands his own defense mechanisms perfectly well, but this understanding does not free him from them. He knows that his resentment is irrational, his social philosophy is self-serving, and his isolation is self-imposed. But knowing these things only makes his problems worse rather than better. He becomes trapped in endless layers of self-consciousness, analyzing his analysis of his analysis until he can no longer distinguish between genuine insight and psychological manipulation. This represents a profound discovery about the limits of psychological self-awareness as a therapeutic tool. Simply understanding your problems does not automatically solve them, and excessive self-analysis can become a new form of psychological pathology. Dostoevsky also anticipated many insights about the relationship between psychological trauma and adult behavior patterns. Many of his characters have experienced childhood abuse, abandonment, or other forms of early trauma that continue to influence their adult relationships and life choices. Smerdyakov's murderous hatred stems partly from his experience of being an illegitimate child who was never fully accepted by his father or his social environment. Nastasia Filipovna's self-destructive behavior in The Idiot reflects her psychological devastation from childhood sexual abuse. The underground man's social anxiety and resentment can be traced to early experiences of humiliation and rejection. But Dostoevsky never presents trauma as a complete explanation for adult behavior because that would eliminate moral responsibility and the possibility of redemption. Trauma influences but does not determine adult choices, and people retain the capacity to transcend their psychological conditioning through spiritual transformation. One of Dostoevsky's most important psychological insights concerns the role of guilt and conscience in human motivation. Many of his characters are driven by unconscious guilt about real or imagined wrongdoing, and this guilt manifests itself in various forms of self-punishment and self-sabotage. Raskolnikov's illness and eventual confession result from his psychological inability to live with the guilt of murder, even though he consciously believes that his action was justified. The underground man's self-isolation and misery represent a form of self-imposed punishment for his perceived moral and social failures. Ivan Karamazov's mental breakdown reflects his unconscious sense of responsibility for his father's murder, even though he did not directly participate in the crime. These characters demonstrate that conscience operates as an autonomous psychological force that cannot be eliminated through rational argument or philosophical sophistication. But Dostoevsky also understood that guilt could be pathological and destructive rather than morally beneficial. Excessive guilt can lead to psychological paralysis, self-hatred, and the inability to accept forgiveness and redemption. Some of his characters become so consumed by guilt that they lose the capacity for positive action and healthy relationships. They become addicted to suffering as a way of appeasing their punitive superego, but this suffering does not lead to genuine moral improvement or spiritual growth. True redemption requires not the elimination of guilt, but its transformation through grace and genuine repentance. This insight anticipates modern therapeutic approaches that distinguish between healthy guilt that promotes moral behavior and neurotic guilt that inhibits psychological functioning. Dostoevsky's analysis of love and sexuality was equally profound and ahead of its time. He understood that romantic love often involves psychological projection, wish fulfillment, and the attempt to use another person to solve one's own internal conflicts. Characters like Nastasia Filipovna and Grushenka are loved not for who they really are, but for what they represent in the psychological economy of their admirers. Prince Mishkin's love for Nastasia is partly motivated by his need to save someone as a way of giving meaning to his own suffering. Dmitry Karamazov's passion for Grushenka reflects his unconscious search for maternal acceptance and approval. These relationships are psychologically complex rather than simply romantic, because they involve the intersection of multiple unconscious needs and conflicts. Dostoevsky also anticipated insights about the psychology of power and dominance that would later be developed by thinkers like Nietzsche and Adler. Many of his characters are motivated by what psychologists would call the will to power, the need to assert control over their environment and other people as a way of compensating for feelings of inadequacy and vulnerability. Raskolnikov's theory about extraordinary individuals is really a rationalization for his psychological need to feel superior to ordinary people. The underground man's intellectual sophistication serves partly as a weapon for asserting dominance over those he considers less insightful than himself. Ivan Karamazov's atheistic philosophy functions partly as a way of asserting his independence from divine authority. These characters show how intellectual and spiritual pursuits can be corrupted by unconscious power drives that operate beneath the surface of conscious motivation. Perhaps Dostoevsky's most profound psychological insight concerns the relationship between suffering and psychological development. He understood that people often unconsciously seek out suffering because it serves important psychological functions that pleasure and happiness cannot provide. Suffering can validate one's sense of being special or different from others. It can provide a sense of meaning and purpose for those who feel that their lives are otherwise insignificant. It can serve as a form of self-punishment that appeases guilt and provides relief from psychological tension. It can create bonds of sympathy and connection with others who have also suffered. And it can serve as a catalyst for spiritual growth and transformation that would not occur under comfortable circumstances. This understanding of suffering as psychologically functional rather than simply pathological was far ahead of its time and remains controversial even today. Dostoevsky's psychological insights were not merely theoretical, but practical and therapeutic. His novels function as a form of psychological healing for readers who recognize their own conflicts and struggles in his characters. By seeing their problems dramatized with honesty and compassion, readers can begin to understand and accept aspects of themselves that they might otherwise deny or repress. By witnessing characters who achieve redemption and transformation despite their psychological wounds, readers can maintain hope for their own healing and growth. Dostoevsky's work provides what psychologists would later call corrective emotional experiences that can help people move beyond destructive patterns and achieve greater psychological integration. This therapeutic dimension of his writing helps explain why his novels continue to have such a powerful impact on readers more than a century after they were written. Part 12. The Rejection of Western Civilization and the Return to Soil. Dostoevsky believed that Western European civilization was leading humanity towards spiritual catastrophe, and that Russia's salvation lay in rejecting Western ideas and returning to its own native spiritual and cultural roots. This was not mere nationalist prejudice, but a carefully developed philosophical position based on his analysis of what he saw as the fundamental errors of Western thought and their inevitable consequences. Western civilization, he argued, had chosen the path of rational materialism, individual autonomy and technological progress at the expense of spiritual depth, communal solidarity and transcendent meaning. This choice had produced societies that were materially prosperous but spiritually empty, technically advanced but morally confused, and individually free but collectively fragmented. Russia could avoid this fate only by consciously choosing a different path, based on Orthodox Christianity, traditional peasant values, and what he called a return to the soil. Dostoevsky's critique of Western civilization was comprehensive and devastating. He saw Western Christianity as having been corrupted by its alliance with political power and its embrace of rational theology. Both Catholicism and Protestantism had lost the mystical and contemplative dimensions of authentic Christianity in their pursuit of worldly influence and intellectual respectability. Western philosophy had abandoned the search for ultimate truth in favor of skeptical analysis and scientific reduction. Western politics had replaced traditional authority and organic community with artificial contracts and mechanical institutions. Western economics had reduced human relationships to market transactions and transformed everything into a commodity to be bought and sold. The result was a civilization that was technically impressive but spiritually bankrupt. The fundamental error of Western civilization, according to Dostoevsky, was its assumption that human reason could solve all problems and create perfect societies without reference to divine guidance or transcendent truth. This assumption had led Western thinkers to develop elaborate philosophical and political systems that ignored the mysterious and irrational aspects of human nature. They believed that people were essentially rational creatures who would naturally choose their own best interests if given proper education and favourable social conditions. They thought that social institutions could be designed according to rational principles that would eliminate conflict and create universal happiness. They assumed that scientific progress would eventually answer all important questions and solve all significant problems. These beliefs seemed reasonable and progressive, but Dostoevsky saw them as dangerous delusions that would lead to unprecedented tyranny and spiritual destruction. The alternative that Dostoevsky proposed was what he called a return to the soil, a conscious embrace of traditional Russian values and ways of life that had been preserved by the peasantry, despite centuries of westernizing influence from the educated classes. The soil represented not merely agriculture or rural life, but a whole constellation of spiritual and cultural values that were fundamentally different from Western individualism and rationalism. These values included sobernost, the mystical unity of the Orthodox Christian community, conciliarity, the practice of making decisions through spiritual consensus rather than rational debate, humility, the recognition that human wisdom is limited and that ultimate truth comes from God rather than human reason, and suffering love, the willingness to bear the pain of others as a path to spiritual growth and redemption. These values had been preserved in their purest form by the Russian peasantry, who had remained closer to the Orthodox Christian tradition than the westernized aristocracy and intelligentsia. Dostoevsky's idealization of the Russian peasantry was based partly on his own experience during his years of imprisonment in Siberia. He had expected the common criminals in the prison camp to be degraded and brutalized by their circumstances, but instead he found that many of them possessed a spiritual depth and moral sensitivity that was often lacking in educated society. They were capable of extraordinary acts of kindness and self-sacrifice despite their harsh living conditions. They maintained their religious faith despite having every reason to despair. They preserved traditional values of family loyalty, personal honor, and community solidarity that had been weakened or abandoned by Western-influenced intellectuals. Most importantly, they had not lost their capacity for genuine repentance and spiritual transformation. Their suffering had made them more rather than less human, while the comfort and education of the upper classes had often made them more selfish and spiritually shallow. This experience convinced Dostoevsky that the Russian people possessed a unique spiritual wisdom that could save not only Russia but the entire world from the spiritual crisis of modernity. While Western civilization was moving toward materialism, atheism, and social fragmentation, Russia had preserved the authentic Christian understanding of human nature and social organization. Russian Orthodoxy maintained the mystical and contemplative traditions that Western Christianity had lost. Russian peasant culture preserved communal values and practices that Western individualism had destroyed. Russian literature and art expressed spiritual insights that Western rationalism could not comprehend. If Russia could resist the temptation to imitate Western models and instead develop according to its own spiritual principles, it could become a beacon of hope for all humanity. But Dostoevsky's vision of Russia's messianic mission was complicated by his recognition that Russian society was itself deeply corrupted by Western influences. The Russian aristocracy had been imitating Western European culture for generations and had lost touch with their own spiritual roots. Russian intellectuals were often more Western than the Westerners themselves, embracing radical ideologies that even European thinkers found extreme. Russian institutions were increasingly modelled on Western patterns rather than traditional Orthodox principles. Even the Russian Orthodox Church had been influenced by Western theological methods and had lost some of its original spiritual purity. The return to the soil could not be accomplished simply by rejecting foreign influences, but required a conscious spiritual renewal that would restore Russia's connection to its own deepest traditions. This spiritual renewal would require a fundamental transformation of Russian education, culture, and social organization. Instead of imitating Western universities and teaching Western philosophy, Russian educational institutions should focus on Orthodox theology, traditional Russian literature, and the practical wisdom of peasant culture. Instead of copying Western social and political institutions, Russia should develop forms of governance and social organization based on Orthodox principles of soberness and conciliarity. Instead of pursuing Western models of economic development, Russia should create an economy based on mutual aid, communal ownership, and spiritual rather than material values. This transformation would not be easy, because it would require the educated classes to abandon their privileged position and learn from those they had traditionally considered their inferiors. But it was necessary if Russia was to fulfill its destiny as the spiritual leader of humanity. Dostoevsky believed that this spiritual mission was not merely a matter of cultural preference, but a cosmic necessity. The Western path of rationalism and materialism was leading humanity toward spiritual death and ultimate meaninglessness. If this process continued unchecked, Human beings would lose their capacity for genuine love, faith, and moral responsibility. They would become sophisticated animals, pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain, but incapable of transcending their biological nature. Science and technology would advance, but human beings would become less, rather than more human. Social organization would become more efficient, but individual souls would become more empty and degraded. The end result would be a form of civilization that was technically advanced but spiritually dead. Only a civilization based on Orthodox Christian principles could reverse this process and restore humanity's connection to transcendent meaning and purpose. Such a civilization would not reject science and technology, but would subordinate them to spiritual goals rather than making them ends in themselves. It would not eliminate individual freedom, but would ground that freedom in spiritual rather than materialistic values. It would not destroy social progress, but would define progress in terms of spiritual development rather than material accumulation. It would create a form of modernity that was compatible with, rather than opposed to, traditional wisdom and spiritual insight. This was Russia's mission, to show the world that it was possible to be both modern and spiritual, both technically competent and morally grounded. But Dostoevsky also recognized that this mission might fail. Russia might succumb to Western influences and lose its unique spiritual character. The Russian people might choose material comfort over spiritual depth, rational sophistication over mystical wisdom, individual autonomy over communal solidarity. If this happened, Russia would become just another Western country, and humanity would lose its last hope for spiritual renewal. The world would then proceed inexorably toward the spiritual catastrophe that Dostoevsky saw as the inevitable endpoint of Western civilization. The choice was stark. Either Russia would fulfill its messianic mission and save the world, or the world would be lost to materialism and spiritual death. This vision of Russia's role in world history was both inspiring and dangerous. It provided a sense of meaning and purpose that helped many Russians maintain their cultural identity in the face of Western pressure for modernization and westernization. But it also encouraged a form of nationalist arrogance that could be used to justify almost any action taken in the name of Russia's spiritual mission. If Russia was destined to save the world, then anything that served Russian interests could be presented as serving the interests of humanity itself. If Orthodox Christianity was the only authentic form of Christianity, then other forms of Christianity could be treated as heresies that deserved to be eliminated. If Russian culture was spiritually superior to Western culture, then Russians had the right and obligation to impose their values on other peoples for their own good. The same vision that could inspire genuine spiritual renewal could also justify imperialism, religious persecution, and cultural chauvinism. Part 13. The Eternal Struggle, Faith, Suffering, and Dostoevsky's Vision for Humanity. At the very center of Dostoevsky's philosophical universe lies an eternal battle between faith and doubt that can never be definitively resolved through rational argument or empirical evidence, combined with his revolutionary understanding that suffering is the fundamental condition through which human beings achieve spiritual growth and authentic meaning. These twin insights form the foundation of his enduring legacy and his prophetic vision for humanity's future. This struggle is not merely an intellectual debate about the existence of God, but an existential crisis that affects every aspect of human existence. While suffering is not an unfortunate accident to be eliminated, but the crucible in which human souls are refined and transformed. Together, these insights create a philosophy that is both deeply challenging and ultimately redemptive. Dostoevsky himself embodied this struggle throughout his entire life. His arrest, imprisonment and years in Siberia subjected his faith to the most severe possible tests while teaching him that extreme suffering could serve as a pathway to spiritual transformation. He witnessed cruelty and suffering that seemed to make a mockery of belief in a loving God, yet he also observed how those prisoners who accepted their suffering without becoming consumed by hatred often developed extraordinary capacities for kindness, wisdom, and moral insight. This experience convinced him that the deepest forms of human wisdom, compassion and spiritual insight emerge only through profound suffering that cannot be avoided or easily resolved. The mature Dostoevsky, who emerged from this ordeal, was neither a simple believer nor a straightforward atheist, but something much more complex and interesting, a man whose faith had been tested by doubt and refined by suffering. This complex relationship between faith, doubt and suffering is dramatized most powerfully through his greatest characters. Ivan Karamazov represents the most sophisticated case for atheism ever presented in literature, rejecting God not on scientific grounds but on moral ones, unable to accept a universe in which innocent children suffer while God remains silent. His rebellion cannot be overcome through theological sophistication because it is based on a fundamental moral judgment about the nature of reality itself. Yet Dostoevsky shows us that Ivan's atheism leads inevitably to moral relativism and nihilistic despair, undermining the very moral foundations that would make his fight against injustice meaningful. Against Ivan stands his brother Alyosha, who chooses to trust in God's goodness despite evidence that seems to contradict it, and this choice transforms his entire relationship to existence, freeing him to respond with spontaneous love and compassion rather than intellectual paralysis. The philosophy of redemptive suffering is embodied most clearly in characters like Sonia Marmeladova, who maintains her spiritual purity despite degraded circumstances, and Father Zosima, who teaches that all human beings are responsible for the suffering of others, and that true spiritual development requires accepting this responsibility. Sonia's suffering has not made her bitter, but has deepened her capacity for love and forgiveness, allowing her to see the divine image even in a murderer like Raskolnikov. Zosima demonstrates how suffering can be transformed into spiritual wisdom, arguing that those who achieve spiritual maturity through suffering become channels through which divine grace can enter the world. But Dostoevsky also shows that suffering can be destructive rather than redemptive, depending on how it is received. The underground man's pain has made him spiteful. Ivan's intellectual anguish has led to rebellion against God, and Smerdyakov's abuse has turned him into a murderer. The difference lies not in the amount of pain experienced, but in the spiritual attitude with which that pain is received. Redemptive suffering requires what Dostoevsky calls active love, the willingness to bear not only one's own pain, but the pain of others as well. This is not mere sympathy, but a practical commitment to sharing others' burdens, even when doing so increases one's own suffering. Such love can only emerge from those who have learned to accept their own suffering without resentment, transforming their pain into wisdom and compassion. Prince Mishkin embodies this principle through his Christ-like innocence and willingness to suffer for others, though his very goodness becomes tragically ineffective in a world unprepared to receive such unconditional love. Yet Dostoevsky suggests that even apparently failed acts of redemptive love plant seeds of grace that may bear fruit in future generations, operating on spiritual rather than merely practical levels. The eternal struggle between faith and doubt, combined with the transformative potential of suffering, leads to Dostoevsky's prophetic understanding of humanity's future. Writing decades before the rise of totalitarian movements, he predicted with astonishing accuracy how revolutionary ideologies would evolve into systems of mass oppression and psychological control. The Grand Inquisitor's vision of a society based on bread, miracle and authority perfectly anticipated the appeal of fascist and communist regimes that would seduce millions with promises of security and relief from the burden of freedom. His novels demonstrated how intellectual sophistication and humanitarian ideals could be corrupted into justifications for terrorism and mass murder, showing that the greatest evils would come from educated idealists who believed they were serving humanity. These political prophecies remain essential for understanding contemporary threats to human freedom and dignity. But Dostoevsky's psychological insights have proven equally prophetic and enduring. His exploration of the unconscious mind, the divided self, and the complex motivations that drive human behavior anticipated major psychological discoveries by decades. His understanding of how excessive self-consciousness can paralyze effective action perfectly describes the condition of millions of modern people who know what they should do but cannot bring themselves to do it. His analysis of how childhood trauma, social alienation and spiritual emptiness create psychological disorders remains more penetrating than most contemporary theories. Most importantly, his insight that psychological healing requires spiritual transformation rather than merely technical intervention offers hope for those whom secular psychology has failed to help. The spiritual dimensions of Dostoevsky's work have become even more relevant, as modern secular culture has failed to provide the meaning and transcendent significance that human beings need. His prediction that the loss of religious faith would lead to nihilism and moral relativism has been confirmed by societies that have attempted to build purely secular forms of meaning. His understanding that human beings cannot live without transcendent purpose helps explain why secular ideologies so often function as substitute religions, complete with sacred texts and demands for absolute loyalty. His vision of faith as an existential choice rather than an intellectual conclusion provides a way of maintaining religious commitment even in the face of modern criticism and scientific skepticism. Faith, for Dostoevsky, is not the absence of doubt but the decision to trust in ultimate meaning despite evidence that seems to contradict it. Perhaps most importantly, Dostoevsky's legacy lies in his unflinching honesty about the complexity and difficulty of human existence, combined with his ultimate hope for human transformation. He refused to offer easy solutions or comfortable reassurances, acknowledging the strongest arguments against his own positions through characters as intelligent and sympathetic as those who represent his preferred alternatives. He recognized that the choice between faith and doubt, freedom and security, love and power cannot be resolved through rational argument alone, but requires fundamental decisions about how to interpret life's ambiguous evidence. This intellectual honesty makes his ultimate affirmations more meaningful because they emerge from genuine struggle with doubt and despair rather than naive optimism. Dostoevsky's vision for humanity is both deeply pessimistic and ultimately hopeful. He recognized that human beings are capable of extraordinary evil and that social progress does not automatically lead to moral improvement. He understood that the loss of traditional sources of meaning would create psychological crises that could not be easily resolved through rational analysis or social reform. He predicted that attempts to create perfect societies through human effort alone would inevitably lead to tyranny and the destruction of everything that makes life worth living. Yet he also believed that humans are capable of transcending their limitations through spiritual transformation and redemptive love, achieving levels of wisdom and compassion that approach the divine. He demonstrated through his greatest characters that even the most degraded individuals can be redeemed through genuine repentance and acceptance of grace. The choice that Dostoevsky presents to humanity remains as relevant today as it was in 19th century Russia. We can choose the path of the Grand Inquisitor, seeking security and relief from freedom's burden, even at the cost of our humanity. We can choose Ivan Karamazov's path, demanding that reality conform to our moral expectations and rejecting any universe that fails to meet our standards. We can choose the underground man's path, retreating into bitter isolation as a way of asserting autonomy in an apparently meaningless world. Or we can choose the path of Christ as Dostoevsky understood it, accepting the burden of freedom and responsibility while trusting in the possibility of redemption through love. This choice must be renewed constantly throughout our lives and will determine not only our own fate, but the fate of human civilization itself. In our current historical moment, when traditional sources of meaning continue to weaken while new forms of control threaten human freedom, Dostoevsky's insights are more essential than ever. His warnings about utopian thinking speak directly to contemporary movements that promise to solve all problems through correct theories and techniques. His understanding of psychological manipulation anticipates sophisticated forms of propaganda that characterize modern mass societies. His analysis of how spiritual emptiness leads to despair helps explain epidemics of depression and suicide that plague even prosperous societies. His vision of love as ultimate reality offers the only realistic hope for overcoming the hatred and division that threaten human civilization. The final message of Dostoevsky's philosophical legacy is both challenging and encouraging. Challenging because it demands that we abandon comfortable illusions about human nature and face existence's full complexity. Challenging because it requires taking responsibility for our choices without the security of absolute certainty about what is right. Challenging because it calls us to love when love is not returned, forgive when forgiveness is not deserved, and hope when hope seems impossible. But encouraging because it demonstrates that humans can rise above their limitations to achieve consciousness and moral development that justify existence's suffering and struggle. Encouraging because it shows that even the darkest circumstances cannot completely extinguish human dignity and the possibility of redemption. Encouraging because it proves that love, truth and spiritual reality are stronger than hatred, deception and material force, even when their victory is not immediately visible. Dostoevsky's philosophy offers no easy answers, but provides something far more valuable. A vision of what human beings can become when they choose to embrace rather than flee from their condition's full reality. It shows that life's meaning is found not in the absence of suffering, but in suffering's transformation into love. It demonstrates that freedom is not the elimination of constraints, but the conscious choice to serve something greater than ourselves. It proves that faith is not the absence of doubt, but the decision to trust in ultimate meaning, despite contradictory evidence. These insights remain as revolutionary today as when Dostoevsky first articulated them, continuing to offer hope and guidance for anyone seeking authentic existence in a world often hostile to such aspirations. The mind of Fyodor Dostoevsky contained wisdom that humanity is still learning to understand and apply. His legacy challenges us to face reality without illusion while maintaining hope without naivety. to love without conditions while accepting responsibility without excuses, to choose freedom while bearing its full weight and cost. This is perhaps the most difficult path humans can walk, but it is also the only path that leads to genuine fulfillment and authentic meaning. Those who choose this path join a communion of souls that transcends time and circumstance, united by their commitment to truth, love, and the endless struggle to become more fully human. This is Dostoevsky's ultimate gift, not a philosophical system or easy answers, but a vision of what we can become when we choose to live with courage, honesty, and love in the face of life's eternal mysteries.